Hi, good evening everybody, and welcome to the daily Rambam Shir, 3 chapters per day, lesson number 95 and 96, the ruling of Ma'acholes Asures, forbidden food, from the 2nd until the 7th chapter. A Jew comes into a restaurant where they sell shawarma. He turns to the owner and he asks him, "Is the food kosher over here?" Instead of a response, he points out at the wall and shows to the person who asked the question, "Take a look, a huge picture framed with a beautiful frame, the picture of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai." And he tells him, "This is not enough for you." He says, "Well, if you would be the one who would be hanging on the wall and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai would be the one who is serving the shawarma, I would be much calmer." So in the Medrash, they bringing an entire explanation about the necessity of introducing the Jewish people with such strict dietary law, with the guidelines of kashrus. And the general mashal, parable, analogy that they are introducing to two people who came to a doctor. And only to this gentleman, where the doctor have seen that there is a chance to prolong his life, he prescribed him a very strict diet. With the other person, where he noticed or he paid attention that there is no point or there is no chance to prolong his life, he did not prescribe him this dietary. As we know that the mission of the Jewish people is to be the testimonial of the existence and the leadership of God upon earth. Atem Eidai, you are my witnesses. Same way as God is eternal, the Jewish people are also eternal. For that reason, he prescribed a very strict diet to them in order to keep them on a permanent basis on this planet. And amongst the commentators of the Bible, of the Torah, and the authorities who are providing reasons, we see a few different approaches to explain the reasoning behind the dietary laws, what we call the Hilchos Kashrus. There is one approach that says that as far as for our bodies, there is, as we can see, many people live perfectly in a very healthy state without keeping the dietary of kashrus. So the reason that it was given anyway, in order to refine our soul, to have our soul able to express itself via those vessels, that what is called body. This is one explanation. But then there is another explanation, and they are using the following analogy. We know there are people who live in the villages and people who live in the metropolitan. And we know that people who live in the villages, their ability, their resistance to tolerate very harsh type of food is way bigger than people who live in the cities. They are much more sensitive and much more susceptible to anything that is not delicate. For that reason, the type on the material, the quality, even of the bodies of the Jewish people are being due to the special godly soul that is implanted to them. So their sensitivity towards food, towards something that is not in line with the kosher dietary laws, is also damaging and harming their body as well. Since our primary subject for the upcoming few days is the rulings of kashrus. So we're going to go.
Yeah, sure.
Of course.
I've heard that there's two things you should not ask why. Our hygiene rules and kosher.
You're right. Although that they will be belong to the category of hukim. Hukim is the category, as you say, when it comes to hygiene, to tum'ah and tahara. You're talking about ritual, about pure spiritual purity and impurity. That's what you're referring to? Tum'ah and tahara.
I think not only that, but even if we sleep even half an hour, we have to wash our hands.
Yeah.
This kind of
Tum'ah v'tahara, correct. That generally belongs to the category of hukim. Hukim is those type of rules that not necessarily they are linked to explanation and understanding. Yet we have found amongst our commentators and our sages that even those types of hukim, they do provide somewhat of an explanation. There is always, even by the way, even to this ruling as paraduma that everybody agrees that this belongs to the hukim, we find even Rashi itself brings somewhat a symbolic explanation. So, as I say, obviously the reason why we have to follow those rules because of the order of God Almighty, nevertheless, as much as we can find reasoning that will inspire, will strengthen our commitment to those hukim, it is always recommendable. So while yesterday we were covering the type of species that are permitted or not permitted, today we will zoom in to the type of prohibition that is associated with those species. Like yesterday we covered the animal, the beast, the fish, the birds, the grasshoppers, which type of them is permitted and which type of it is prohibited. Today, the Rambam introduced a new aspect, a new dimension. As we have learned many times, some prohibitions, they are negative in their nature, and some prohibitions, they are positive in their nature. So when it comes to dietary laws and those specific species which are not permitted, each and every one of them is associated with both, with a negative commandment and with a prohibition of a positive commandment. For example, the positive commandment, since the Torah lists which are the 10 types of animals which are permitted, so you know that any type of a species that not included in those 10 will be prohibited, but the violation will be a positive violation. In addition, there is also a negative violation. How do I know? Since it is written that any animal that is not possessing two signs, or it says even if it possesses only one sign, it will be prohibited. So you know how much more so an animal that doesn't have neither of them, how much more so will be prohibited. So for that reason, when a person eats any animal, let's say for example, he eats a camel, flesh of a camel, or he eats a pig, he will be violating a negative commandments and he will be violating a positive commandment. On the other hand, if a person will eat a flesh of a human, cannibalism, he will be violating only positive commandments, because there is no outright text in the Torah that says you should not eat flesh of a man. Since it is written, these are those animals that are permitted, so it implies that a flesh of a human that is not mentioned over there, so it will be associated with a violation of a aseh. a violation of a positive commandment. The obvious implication, we know that lashes, malchus, a person receives only when he violates a negative commandments. When he is violating a positive commandment, there is no lashes. We covered as well the size, the measurement, at what point a person is being exposed to the violation of a law or a essay. So, as a rule, when it comes to isurei maichol, to prohibition of prohibited food, as a rule, it is a kezais, a aleph sized. Talking about volume, in a volume of a aleph, that's the minimum amount required for a person to be in violation and exposure to malchus, to lashes. Though midoiraise even less than a kezais it is prohibited, but nevertheless, as far as the malchus, it comes the kezais. There is a few exceptions, and the exceptions is those 8 insects that are mentioned in the Torah. For example, there is a turtle, a rat, that they are part of those insects that are mentioned in the Torah. So their measurement that will expose the person into a violation is lesser than a kezais. It will be a shiur of a dosho. A dosho is about a shiur of 3 grains, 2 grains. That's the general measurement of it.
What rats and turtles, they are not insects.
Sherets. How it's called? Sherets? Insects, yeah? Sherets, it's a type of Sherets omru batoyom.
Crawling.
They are running from the snakes, they are crawling.
Crawling on the earth.
You mean that they cannot fly? There is a lot of them cannot fly.
Oh, so here it's interesting talking about, in this particular perek, he covers that all type of, when we're talking about insects, some of the insects will be considered insects that will belong flying insects, some will be crawling insects, some of the insects will belong to the water, swimming insects, and sometimes will be a type of an insect that can crawl, that can fly, and can swim. For that reason, some of those insects, if a person in theory will eat even one insect who is capable to obtain all those qualities from crawling, flying, he will be exposed to 3 violations just by eating one creature. Now there is also worms. The idea of, in Hebrew, type of the called toilos. Toilos is worms. Now worms, we can find them inside the food, inside of fruit, inside of fish. So worms, yeah? Those type of worms are also prohibited, regardless what is their size, as long as the person eats them as a whole, whether they are alive or whether they are dead. So though they don't possess the measurement of a aleph, nevertheless, since he eats them the way they are, and that's called beria, in the original creation of them entirely, so this itself assigns a importance to them where a typical measurement is not necessary for the person to be in violation of that particular prohibition. So for that reason, even if a person ate a very tiny, minuscule type of worm, he will be in violation. Let's say if a person ate chopped worm, if it is chopped and it's not in the original form, then in order for him to be in violation, he must get a measurement of a kezais, and without this measurement, he is not exposed to any type of violation.
But sometimes, as we know, that they could be in our stomach by itself without
Correct.
eating.
We're talking over here when a person is aware, he's able to detect them. When an individual, the only exposure to deliberate violation is only when there is full awareness, when there is the ability to detect them, and nevertheless, the person goes ahead and he chooses to violate the prohibition, only then he is liable. Otherwise, a person is not going to be liable. That's
What it has to do with the desire of person, that's not his choice. They get born in us because of whatever food they.
So obviously, when we're talking about creatures where a person cannot detect them, obviously he's not liable. We're talking over here when a person is capable to detect those worms, and despite his ability to detect them, he chooses to ignore the prohibition. So then, what will be his ruling? That's exactly what we are dealing today.
But sometimes person, with help of doctor, sometimes Rachel could determine that he does have some worms inside us.
Yeah, that goes without saying. We're speaking over here not our worms, worms that we are detecting in food. We see food and we see inside the food there is worms. So that's exactly what we are dealing today.
Whatever.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah,
happen,
that goes without saying. So it is interesting, and this is a general ruling when it comes to worms. The Rambam gives following principle that while the tree or while the fruit is connected to the ground, connected to the tree, while the fruit is connected to the tree, so a person will be, and he sees that there is a worm inside the fruit, obviously it is prohibited. However, biblically, after the fruit was chopped from the tree, and yet the worm is inside the fruit and did not came out and crawled upon the ground, it still remains inside the fruit. So then a person biblically, he's not going to be in violation of any kind, because the text, the way it appears in the Torah, that the prohibition applies only when the worm have exited the fruit. But while it is still on the fruit after the fruit was chopped from the tree, there is no biblical violation. There is a very interesting passage in the book of Psalms where King David refers about himself, Ve'onoichi toila'as ve'loi ish. I am a worm and not a human. So there are many interpretations to explain this sentence, but I heard a beautiful one, and this was a wish where David HaMelech was wishing, given the fact there are so many people who are so careful, and rightfully so, not to violate, and even as we have just learned, from a fraction of a worm that is in a size of less than a dime, people will stay away and will be careful not to swallow and not eat. So King David says, I wish I would be a worm, so people will be so careful not to eat me, not to bite me, not to harm me. Unfortunately, I'm not a worm yet, so people feel very loosely comfortable to violate me, to embarrass and to insult me. This is an interesting explanation. In the second chapter of the daily Rambam Shir, we are speaking about the byproduct of those prohibited food items that they are prohibited. Offshoots, dividends. For example, we have learned yesterday about species that they are considered to be tomei, behemoth meo, any type of an animal that is not kosher in the sense it doesn't have split hooves and chewing cud, it will be a treif animal. What's about the milk of such animal? What's about the eggs of such animal, of such bird? So the ruling, since it says in the Torah the letter ve'es, typically everywhere where it says in the Torah the word ve'es, end, it's a way, it's a connecting word that sometimes it is not necessary to write unless it comes to teach you something and to add you something. So since it was an extra word was inserted in the Torah in connection of those forbidden animals, so the extra word came to teach us that also the byproduct of such an animal in most cases will be prohibited. However, it is very important to note, though it is prohibited biblically, but nevertheless there is no liability of malchus associated with it, and it will be on the same level as we have mentioned before about chotzi shiur. Chotzi shiur, translated loosely, half a measurement. As we have learned before, the classical measurement, minimum measurement that is associated with any type of prohibition is a kezais. What's about half a measurement, half a kezais? We have learned that though biblically it is prohibited, nevertheless it is forbidden to get involved with that type of a issue. Same way when it comes to a byproduct of an animal, though biblically it is prohibited, but nevertheless there is no liability of malchus associated with it. There is a few exceptions. For example, a bee that produces honey, though the bee is a prohibited insect that we are forbidden to eat, yet the honey that it produces, it is permitted. And the reason, because the honey is not part of them, is the nectar that they are collecting out of the flowers and the grass, and for that reason we have permitted the honey that the bees are producing.
That's a long discussion about that, but okay.
Yeah. Now, another item that happens to be a byproduct of a person. We spoke before that human flesh, a human, is a prohibited item to eat biblically, though it is not a negative violation, it's a positive violation, but nevertheless, biblically it is prohibited. Yet, the milk of a human will be permitted, not only for an infant who is being breastfed by his mother, but even by an adult, as long as he is not sucking the milk directly out of the breast, but he is consuming it via a cup, it will be permitted. Now, another type of interesting byproduct. When we're talking about milk, so many times I cannot make a distinction when it comes to milk, whether it came from a kosher animal or the milk came from a non-kosher animal. However, when I see cheese, there is no way that non-kosher animal will be able to produce that type of cheese, because the idea of a cheese, the process, the solidifying the actual milk can come only from kosher animals. However, given the fact that it is customary to use to solidify the cheese, the stomach of a animal that has been by died on its own from a nevelo or a treifo or a non-kosher animal being used as catalyst in order to produce this cheese. So any format of catalyst cannot really be annulled. Later on, we're going to be introduced to the rules of ta'arives. When two products, one of them is kosher and the other one is non, and they came in a form of mixture, so as long as there is or a majority or 60 times, so another type of measurement of the kosher over the non-kosher, so the non-kosher will be annulled and nullified, and the entire mixture will be acceptable. But there is a few exceptions. If the non-kosher item in the ta'arives, in the mixture, happen to be a or an important one, or a spicy one, or a very special one. For example, when it's called dover hama'amid, an item that is able to solidify, and it turns to be the catalyst that thanks to him the entire cheese was able to be processed. So therefore, even though the cheese can come only from a milk of a kosher animal, but due to the practice of the non-Jewish people to solidify the cheese via a kavo, via the stomach of a non-kosher animal, for that reason it was prohibited, and the only way to permit it, when I see full Jewish supervision and kashrus supervision that was done from a skin of a. There is a difference whether you're doing it with the skin of its stomach or whether you're doing it with its stomach itself. If you're doing it with the skin of the stomach, it's a problem. If you're doing it with the stomach itself, it's not a problem. Later on, we're going to see also why. We're going to come to the next chapter. Then there is other unknown items when I'm coming and interested to purchase a egg, and I don't know whether the egg is from a kosher or non-kosher. So the general signs to detect a egg that comes from a kosher bird is by the shape. Typically, always the upper side, or one side will be narrow and the other side will be wide, while an egg from a non-kosher bird will have equal shape from both sides, from the top and from the bottom. Another distinction will be between an egg from a kosher and non-kosher type of a bird, while talking about the placement of the yolk versus the white in the egg. While a non-kosher egg will have the white inside the yolk, by a kosher egg, it's most of the time it's the opposite. In the Rambam's ruling, the general way for a person to be able to trace that the egg is indeed kosher is by have a reliable source of the person who is actually involved in the industry to inform and to direct him about that. Today, in reality, though, given the fact that the most common eggs that are in the market are coming from kosher birds, for that reason, it is customary to obtain, to buy the eggs without any problem. But definitely, as you can see, not always the case was like this in reality, and for that reason, the Rambam provided different guidelines as far as the purchase, the consumption of eggs, and so on.
But that's okay to mix yellow with white.
Yeah. Oh,
For food.
so after making sure that there is no blood traces in the, because if there is any blood, so if the blood is in the yolk, the entire egg is not edible, not consumable. If it is in the white, so according to the Rambam, although some people taking more stringencies, he will have to separate between the white and the yolk. That's now in the. However, if it was in a hard-boiled eggs, the assumption after they already it's hard-boiled, they can eat it the way it is. That's the. Now, in the third chapter, the discussion is about a dead. There is a prohibition in the Torah. If an animal is died without proper slaughter, it will be called nevelo. Nevelo, an animal who is dead without proper slaughter. There is two implications. There is one implication that it is forbidden to eat this type of animal, and the prohibition is a negative prohibition. But then there is also another implication. If a person touches or carries this animal, he becomes ritually unpure. He becomes, and for that reason, he cannot enter the temple, he cannot consume any holy items. However, it is important to note that this prohibition of nevelo is applicable only to animals that their species is pure, tohil. In other words, if the concept of a nevelo is only when you're talking about a kosher animal, died without slaughter, so only then a person will be violating the nevelo. But if, let's say, if a horse, which is to begin with, is not a kosher species, have died, and the person will be consuming the flesh of the horse, he's not going to be violating the prohibition of nevelo. He will be violating the prohibition of not a kosher species. Because as we have learned, there is a general ruling of ein isur cholol isur. Now, sometimes a person can eat something alive and he will still be violating a isur of nevelo. For example, a person is taking a living kosher bird, it's alive, and he eats it while it is alive. Since while he is eating it, obviously by eating it in the process, this bird is dying. Doing so, he will be violating nevelo, the issue, the prohibition of nevelo. This is one example that the Rambam presents. There is,
Don't eat cow alive.
in addition to the prohibition of nevelo, there is something which is called treifo. The literal translation of treifo is something that have been prayed. When one animal has been prayed by another animal, so the person, the animal that is praying, it's called toref. He does the praying, and the animal that has been prayed, it's called nitraf, or treifa, the outcome. An animal, the victim, will be treifa. Now, the term treifa refers not necessarily when the animal is already dead as a result from the prey of another animal. Even if the animal still is alive, but he is damaged in such a way that there is no chance he will be able to live more than 12 months. And there is a very specific list of the damages for each and every organ and limb of the animal that will cause termination of life within those 12 months. So such an animal will be considered treifa. Now, although the animal is still alive and you will actually slaughter it, but after slaughtering, you checking the internal system and you discovering that some of the animals, pertaining whether the lungs, the heart, the brain, they are damaged in such a way that they wouldn't make it for 12 months. So the status of this animal and the prohibition will be precisely as it is by nevela. The same prohibition. This is prohibited and this prohibited. However, it is very important to note that not every part of the animal will be associated with nevela. For example, if a person takes for an animal that was not slaughtered, just died on its own, or an animal that was slaughtered but nevertheless turns out that it was treif. If he eats the flesh, obviously he is in violation and he is liable. But there is certain parts of the animal that although it is prohibited, he will not going to be liable. For example, when it comes to the bones, to the nails, to veins, although since they are not eatable or their taste is not a typical way that an animal is being consumed, though it is forbidden, but he will be exempt. Then there is a part, certain parts of the animal that will be permitted to begin with. Which type? Any type, form of a waste of an animal. Any form of a waste of an animal will be permitted to begin with, since it's not even a item that even bedi'eved, so-called after the fact, is sort of eatable. In the 4th chapter, the subject is Eiver min hachai. There is a prohibition that is pertaining not only to Jewish people but to mankind in general. And this is the prohibition to eat a limb cut from a living animal. However, by us, the prohibition is only pertaining to those animals that they are tohir, that they are permitted to eat. By the non-Jews, the prohibition is about any animal. Now, however, in order to violate fully this prohibition, so there's two types of organs. Some organs, they are containing flesh, bones, and veins. Some organs, they may be lacking any bones, like our tongue is an organ. But so when it comes to bones, to prohibition of those organs who are boneless, so the amount that is required to violate is a kezais. A kezais flesh. If a person, kezais is aleph size. When a person consumes the aleph size of the flesh, he will be in violation. When it comes to typical organs, so even if there is no kezais of flesh, but as long as the bone came entirely, bosor gidim v'atzomes, came flesh, veins, and the bones, and he consumed from all of them, although it was not a kezais of flesh, but of all of them together he managed to consume the kezais, he will be liable and And as we said, that will be forbidden. Now, sometimes a person can go and uproot, while an animal is alive, a certain limb out of the animal. And by doing so, he will turn the animal into a treif. The animal won't be able to live more than 12 months as a result of it. So when he is actually eating and consuming this limb that he chopped off from the animal while it is alive, he's actually violating two prohibitions. Prohibition number one, he's actually eating a live organ or limb from a living animal. And second, he happens to eat something that is treif, since it happens by his own action, but as a result of it, there is also treif. There is a very interesting halacha, and this is a general important piece of information. If a person slaughters an animal properly, and after the slaughter, from the animal, he sees inside the animal there is a living fetus, a living. This is called ben bekur. Shlil. It's called. It is kosher without slaughtering it, and the reason is because the slaughter of the mother takes care of him, and he is being viewed as an extension of his mother, and therefore no actual shchite is necessary for him. However, if he managed to stay on the ground, then he requires shchite. As long as he is in his placenta, at the moment that he stood on the ground before the end of the slaughtering, then he will require shchita. Now, let's say if this fetus took out one of his limbs before the completion of slaughtering of his mother. So these particular limbs that popped out before will be considered treifo. Although it's not a typical treifo, but the term treifo will apply to any type of a limb of an organ that popped out from the original boundaries. Since it popped out from the original boundaries, here is another type of a treifo. And for that reason, all I gotta do is just to chop up that particular part of the limb that popped out from the animal, and the rest of the behemoth will be kosher. In the 5th chapter, the Rambam deals with the prohibition of blood. Any form of blood, to consume, to drink, to eat blood, it is prohibited. However, the biblical prohibition is very limited to a very specific blood. Only the blood that comes out when the soul comes out, and also in only this blood that is concentrated in the heart or inside the limbs. Not, for example, this type of blood that is dripping after the animal is not necessarily biblically prohibited. So for that reason, the custom is that any animal, after it's being slaughtered, I'm rinsing the flesh, and after rinsing the flesh, I'm salting the animal entirely and letting the animal be in the salt for at least half an hour. And after the half an hour, I'm rinsing again. the reason for the rinsing, in order to take out the blood. And while the blood is in the mode of coming out, so the general rules, while it is in the mode of coming out from inside to outside, I'm not suspecting that it will go back, and for that reason, after half an hour, I'm rinsing, and the animal will be ready to cook and preparation. Some parts of the animal will require more than just salting. For example, when it comes to the liver that is packed with blood, so the ideal suggestion that the Rambam suggests will be also to roast it. When you roast, the heat will be able to pull out, first of all, to cut it and to roast it. So by doing so, you're getting rid entirely of the blood. Another type of organ that will be problematic is the heart, that he suggests also to chop it and also to soak it in vinegar. While the salt, the function that it pulls out the blood outside, the function of the vinegar that it so-called solidifies where and makes the situation stay static. A very interesting ruling that also comes out from the prohibition of any form of consumption of blood is pertaining the knife of the shochet that slaughters the animal. So it is forbidden to use the knife of the shochet to chop up hot meat. And the reason, since the heat of the meat may cause the blood that is inside, the taste of the blood that is inside the knife to influence the meat as well. Because another example, to use it in a spicy food, spicy ingredient, will also may cause triggering of the blood that is swallowed inside the knife. The reason why it is not after it was used b'di'evet it will be kosher, because there is a debate if the blood that is being swallowed in the knife while he is slaughtering the animal is boiling enough in order to cause a problem that when this knife comes in touch with other warm food or other spicy food will cause a influence about the taste. However, the lechatchila, to begin with, if a person wants to consume it, he can kosher it in a few ways, or via libun. Libun is to warm up, to boil it with fire or with boiling water, or sharpen the knife with a sharpening device, or to stick the knife in the ground 10 times, which can be a replacement to a koshering process. In the 6th chapter, the Rambam deals with the prohibition of fats, chaylev. Not every fat in an animal is prohibited, but certain fats are prohibited, and the severity is very high, even to such an extent of chorus. However, there is some exceptions, which in a case, as we have said before, if the animal is a ben bekuo, an animal that was found inside the womb of the mother when she was slaughtered, where the animal is viewed as part of the organism of the mother, therefore even the chaylev, even the fat, any fat that is inside the animal will be permitted, as a very exceptional ruling in a connection of the Ben Bekuo and Shlil situation. Since we are accustomed to look and Baruch Hashem, find a connection between Inyono de Yoimo, the days that we are currently marking, and the subject in the Rambam that we are covering, there is a very clear connection between the recent subject of the final chapters. There is, as we have just said before, dam, blood, and fat was prohibited in very severe prohibitions. One of the reasons of the prohibition is associated with the fact that in the temple, the only items that always used to be brought as an offering upon the altar, because when it comes to the flesh, some offerings used to consume the flesh on the altars, some were sharing the flesh between the kohanim and between the owners. But when it came to the fat and the blood, any type of offering were taking the fat, and the blood. No types of offering were giving away the fat and the blood to the priests or to the owners of the offerings. For what reason? So Hasidus explains a beautiful explanation. Blood represents enthusiasm. Fat represents pleasure. Many times when a person is in a state of pleasure, he may not necessarily eat and be gluttonous, yet he will gain fat. In the story of the Talmud that is associated with the Churban, with the destruction, there is a famous story that once upon a time, one of the Roman agents who were taking care of Israel, he heard the news that he was appointed to be the Caesar. He heard the news after putting his first shoe before putting the other shoe. After the news came out and he was trying to put the other shoe, he was not able to do it since his other foot was swelled from great pleasure from the piece of news he just heard. He was not able to take out the previous shoes because again it stuck. So we're learning from the story in the Talmud that pleasure is associated with fat. So the point is, when it comes each and every, we are involved in this world, so our involvement in this world should be done in a proper way, should dedicate our attention. However, when the most important parts of our enthusiasm, which is blood, and chaylev, which is pleasure, should be dedicated towards God Almighty. When we are focused and we are proportionally distributing those powers to God and the rest of the power, so then we are maintaining the right balance. And what is also interesting, that when we had the temple, so we had the altar to bring the offerings. But since right now the temple is taken away from us, so Shulchan Shelodom, the table of a human being, is being compared to a mizbeach. So for that reason, the same intention, the same seriousness that a person were having when he was bringing the korbanos, the idea of the food, of the meals, the feasts a person should have, should also be directed l'shem shomayim, that a person eats not just in order to gain pleasure, but to obtain the right powers and the right energy. He should be able to serve God Almighty properly and besimcha of tuv levov. And if we will adopt this type of attitude, God Almighty will return us the real altar and the real temple. Thank you.